So lots of questions for Gary Page, the chairman of the Trust, late this afternoon. He came into the studio. So did Mr. Scott jump or was he pushed?
Michael said to me back in the spring that he intended to retire after the summer. He's approaching 60. He's spent 25 years in the NHS as a chief executive, 40 years of public service, and he felt that it was the right time for him to go.
So when it was introduced as a subject this week, did you introduce it or did he?
No, when he came back from his vacation, he'd decided that now was the time for him to go. So it didn't come as a surprise to me. I was expecting that conversation.
But right at the beginning, he took you from requires improvement into inadequate.
Well, to be fair to Michael, he'd been chief exec for a very short period of time. He inherited a trust that was in a difficult place.
You have had an inspection. You have had an interim report.
Yes.
You haven't published yet. Was his resignation or desire to retire linked to what that report says?
No, as I say, Michael had the conversation in the spring. So whatever that report had said, Michael was going to retire after the summer.
People on the board to do this.
As I say, our job is to improve services. That's what we're working hard to do.
Yeah, but are you the right people to do it, is what I'm saying.
I think this board is capable of delivering the improvement that I've just talked about.
Mr. Page, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello and welcome to Look East. Our top story tonight, the NHS Trust, which runs mental health services in Norfolk and Suffolk, is branded the worst in Britain. It's rated inadequate for a second time after failing to address previous warnings.
Norfolk and Suffolk was the first and only trust that we had put into special measure.
We want to be the best trust ever, we want to be the worst trust.
Hello, the NHS Trust, which cares for people with mental illness in Norfolk and Suffolk, has suffered the crushing blow of being placed into special measures for a second time. It's the only trust of its kind in England to be branded such a failure. Today, the Care Quality Commission rated the Norfolk and Suffolk Foundation Trust as inadequate and said major safety issues remain unresolved. The leadership board came in for particular criticism. Tonight, Look East reveals the human cost behind the struggling service, and we reveal what the Trust is paying the Chief Executive who stood down 2 weeks ago. Julie Cave is the new Chief Executive at the Trust. She was Finance Director but took over at the top when Michael Scott suddenly announced his retirement 2 weeks ago. There is severe criticism of the board, of which obviously you're part, failed to address all serious concerns since 2014.
I think that improvement hasn't happened fast enough, and we completely recognise that. We need to focus on what we've got to do over the next 6 months so that we can show everyone that this trust is much better than we're being portrayed.
But patients have had to deal with a poor service and an unsafe service, according to the CQC, for years now.
There's so much that goes on in mental health, and we want to be the best trust ever. We want
But
to be
you're
the
the
worst
worst trust. How can anyone have faith in this board when the trust has been put in special measures for the second time in 3 years? Shouldn't the whole board go?
Well, we've got a job to do, so I think I'm the sort of person that I am in terms of leading this organisation.
But you've been on the board
I've been the finance
for 22
director.
months. The CQC says the board does not have the drive to affect change. I mean, that is damning.
The CQC report is bad.
How can you reassure patients and their families that they are safe to be treated by your trust?
Well, we have an improvement director working with us from NHS Improvement who will be absolutely supporting me.
Can I just ask you about the outgoing Chief Executive, Michael Scott? He announced his retirement a couple of weeks ago. It's because he couldn't face the music over this report, isn't it?
No, Michael was always going to retire. He was talking about retiring before the CQC came in July, and he felt the time was right now that we've got the CQC reports to free up for the new team.
Come on, Mrs. Cave. If everyone had known he was going to retire, you wouldn't have had to suddenly stand in as Chief Executive. It would have been a planned handover.
But I think, given where we are, then stepping aside to let the new person, if you like, deal with it, I think is probably the right thing.
So he wasn't planning to go at that time. He went because you're back in special measures.
He went because he felt it was right for a new team to take on the challenge.
And was he given any remuneration, any payoff?
No, His contract entitlement, and that's it.
And what was his contract entitlement?
It was 6 months' pay.
So he is walking away with £87,000, even though he'd been planning his retirement for months.
But I think, if you step aside immediately, then that's what will happen. That happens as routine.
And are you planning to stay as chief executive?
Well, earlier I spoke to Simon and asked him what went so wrong and how it might be rectified.
That's a big question. I mean, the Norfolk and Suffolk Foundation Trust has had problems for years. They've had to deal with real term budget cuts of 20% since 2013. They've lost 1 in 4 of their psychiatric beds. It's going to be quite hard, I think, for the Trust to put it right, especially as we've seen in my report that the board was so heavily criticised and the new CEO comes from that board. And today she told Lakeith that she is sorry and she's disappointed by the report.
Well, I think, the fact is that we've got a job to do. We've got to get better at sorting out the things that the CQC has recommended. I'm absolutely determined that we take that challenge and address it quickly. So we'll be working with our staff and with other people who will be there to support us in sorting that out.
It might be said they're at rock bottom now, so is the only way up?
There was one good thing from this report, which was that the overall quality of care from staff was rated good. But I think one issue currently that's going to dominate it is the fact that the previous CEO retired 2 weeks ago, and it turns out that he is still receiving his salary for 6 months as chief executive's salary, but not in the chief executive's role.